Hey, it's me, Beanie. Today we're going to take a look at some weird dinosaur interpretations and see if we can't bring them into the third dimension. Okay, well I may have lied. We're talking about prehistoric creatures, not just the dinosaurs, but one might say that's a weird interpretation, eh?
Police are on the search for this man, known as Binny 3D. Mr. 3D was last seen taking an entire dinosaur skeleton from the local museum and walking out.
Over the years, people have stumbled upon all kinds of weird and usually incomplete fossils. But as we learn more, we get new reconstructions based on the latest findings. Did Spinosaurus swim around? Did the T-Rex have feathers? Why did they make Ark twice? I don't know, and clearly neither did anyone before the 90s, because while I'm sure there's all kinds of good, well-researched stuff sitting around, there's a bunch of equally terrible and weird ones. A majority of supposedly bad dinosaur reconstructions seem to stem from vintage art books and toys of dinosaurs. If you've ever seen the channel Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong, they look at this kind of stuff on the reg. And sure, I get it. If you're a company trying to sell a thing, you probably don't have the resources or just don't really care about being accurate with your toys. But that won't stop me from laughing at you because, I mean, just look at this thing. Whoa! Who goes there?
Allosaurus.
At least according to this line of text right here. It supposedly comes from the How and Why Wonder Book of Dinosaurs, a book published in 1960 full of illustrations of dinosaurs and various dinosaur facts, both of which are mostly outdated. Not to mention this thing doesn't really look like an Allosaurus. It suffers from this weird issue I've noticed a lot of dinosaur drawings from that time seem to have, where all of the theropods are drawn with a kangaroo-like build and a weirdly upright posture. It doesn't help that this guy has a vaguely goblin-esque quality to him. He straight up looks like he's gonna snatch something from you, and he's being real mischievous about it. I mean, look at his fingers, they're like... That being said, it's probably one of the least egregious in our roster, debatably. But we're not here to give this thing a well-worded roast. We're here to take a good hard look at its build. The initial illustration has a pretty identifiable side profile, and if we're gonna block out its shapes, we're gonna need to identify them here. Most objects and characters tend to be made up of multiple simpler shapes varying in complexity, and using this as a guide, we can reassemble these shapes in a 3D space. This is a metaball. This is a polyball. Well, okay, it's a sphere and it's made of polygons, the flat faces that most 3D models are made of. Metaballs, however, work differently. As you can probably see, the metaball has a bit of a different texture to it. But look at what happens if I introduce another metaball. Aha! I think you can see where this is going. These are the shapes I've picked out to build my Allosaurus. All of these are metaballs, yes, even the cubes. So let's put it all together, shall we? Not exactly a one-to-one recreation, I know, but that's because this is a blockout, the initial shape that'll start us off in our creative journey. As it stands, we can't modify this any further without converting our metaballs into polygons. Behold, the worst topology you've ever seen. Topology is the way the faces on a model are arranged, and ideally you want them to be proportionally distributed and have good edge flow, meaning they're fairly well aligned around the shape it's portraying. Luckily, we don't care. At least not yet. For now, we're only worried about making it look good. So let's move on. Metaballs have worked well for our body, but the claws are a bit different. Instead, we're going to go with box modeling. In this situation, we're starting off with a cube made of 6 faces. Polygon faces. I have access to a variety of effects called modifiers that'll help make the modeling process easier. Among these, we'll use the subdivision modifier, which effectively divides the faces of our object into smaller ones and smooths it out. As a result, our cube is now a sphere. But here's the thing, modifiers are non-destructive, which means it's not actually going to make any hard edits to our model until we either export our model or apply the modifier. And check it out, we can still edit it as if it were a cube. Boom, claws. There's also a mirror modifier, and if you guessed that it mirrored an object, you get nothing. We'll get to the other stuff like eyes and teeth later, but for now it's time to sculpt out our dastardly dino. First things first, our dino's looking a little crusty. We ought to smooth out those sharp pixely edges with some subdivision and a smooth brush. There we go, good as new. Now we can get to the good stuff. If anyone's curious, I'm using a brush called Clay Strips, or actually I think it's Clay Buildup, from ZBrush to work a lot of the main detail in here, and we're gonna start with the most glaring first steps to me. The mouth. At the moment, this thing is basically Slendersaur. And we're still like a week out from October, so no spooky business. Yet. Now that we actually have a mouth hole for this thing, our dinosaur's silhouette is vaguely aligned with our reference art, and we can start whittling away at deeper details. This part of the process is a lot of looking between our reference image and our model and sculpting in shapes as I see it, along with some other images of Allosaurus and whatever part of my brain holds all my lucid dinosaur knowledge. The more I look at the proportions, the more it honestly kind of reminds me of these weirdly humanoid dinosaur player models I used to see on Gary's mod all the time. I'll holler out if you ever saw these back in the day, I swear they were always on the front page of the workshop. Speaking of humanoid dinosaurs, I'm no paleontologist, so I can't lie, I'm using reference best I can here, but if anything reads more like a person than a dino, that's more than likely my subconscious knowledge of human anatomy seeping through. But hey, it's on theme, right? Is that accurate? I will say though, the more I work on this, the more I'm realizing that this picture actually shows like almost the whole thing. That might sound kind of weird to some, but if you're not working off of images made specifically to be adapted to 3D with different angles, there's a lot of times where you have to take some creative liberties to account for what you can't see. I used to do a lot of commission work where people would send me like a single low quality image of a character at the most obscure angles and be like, make this please, and I can't really diss them for it, but the point is it is a thing. As we work our way down the Yellow's neck, we're just continuing to build up mass where we want it and digging it away where we don't. This piece of art in particular has a lot of folds to it, which interestingly enough seems to actually be a semi-consistent feature of these vintage dinosaurs, which surprised me, considering a lot of dinosaur media from somewhere around the 90s are shrink-wrapped. Which is a specific term for this type of depiction where the dinosaurs are basically fatless, they're all skin and bone, and we'll touch on that again later down the line. But I bring this up now to make a specific note for any digital sculptors that a good way to do folds is to take away a little mass below the places where you do folds and sculpt in above that, since some people try to do folds and wrinkles by basically carving a line into the surface, which can work for some use cases but usually doesn't look as organic for this one. Moving on down, we're just continuing to sculpt in any musculature where appropriate, with harder angles for places where the bones would jut out, like knuckles, ankles, and knees. But honestly, we're getting there. With enough of the body sculpted, I think it's time to move back to our 3D modeling setup to assemble the teeth and tongue. I'm passing on the gums for this guy because I can't actually see any on the OG picture, and maybe I'm just not squinting hard enough, but I don't think it's gonna ruin our whole deal, so I'm doing it. The process here is basically like the exact same as the claws, creating a cube and pulling out the faces into a nice healthy chomper. Now we can just duplicate it a bunch and align it as necessary and we're golden, just like these big yellow teeth. Given the fact the picture also has this red stuff in the mouth but no visible teeth from the other side of the face, I have to assume that's the tongue. So naturally I'm also box modeling the tongue here with the same setup, except this time I'm also creating more geometry to create a longer and slightly more detailed shape than a simple tooth. I also threw some eyeballs in there, it's literally just the default sphere, so there you go. But now that we've got all the pieces of the head ready, it feels like a better time than any to jump in and detail the face just that little bit more, especially considering it's one of its most iconic aspects. Just look at that smile. I'm actually changing up my brush a little here. It's still the clay build-up brush, but before I was using it with a square-shaped brush, which is cool for making stronger and more definable shapes. But now that I'm going into the finer details, I'm switching to smooth circular strokes that are less likely to break up the shapes and rather blend them together while I sculpt in those features. The areas with the highest details here are around the edges and flaps, like the area surrounding the eyes, nostrils, and mouth and... hold on, this thing doesn't have any ears. Like, I know reptiles don't have big ol' monkey ears and snakes don't even have holes, but dinosaurs do. And I know because I quickly googled it, literally just now while writing this part of the script. The teeth need somewhere to sit in the mouth, so I'm also going to create a bunch of indents on the inside of the mouth to fit it into. That way it can still look a little bit natural, and even though you can't see it in the reference, I'm going to mark in those mouth ridges that make up the roof of your mouth. With the teeth solidly in the mouth, I'm also going to give them a little surface detail too. Nothing special, just a few subtle lines. Same goes for the tongue, pushing in the middle a little and not much else. And now we're up to finishing touches. Not on the whole thing, mind you, but just adjusting some proportions here and there and anywhere that may have looked off earlier in the process that we couldn't catch without seeing a near-finished sculpt. Namely stuff like making the feet a little stubbier, moving the arms to line up better with the original, and making some stuff just generally look a little less wonky. I do use a tablet to sculpt, but if someone put a gun to my head and told me to draw a straight line, I'm sorry. Earlier I mentioned topology, the way the faces on the surface are built. Generally you want these to be optimized, with the extent of that process changing depending on what you're using it for. For example, models for 3D printing don't always necessarily need good topology, but 3D printing also follows its own weird line of requirements. You can drip a bunch of hot plastic into a shape. Meanwhile, models for games on your phone have to run well on a small portable device and usually consist of much more optimization. We're somewhere in the middle, since I plan to animate these, but I also don't want my PC to explode while I'm doing it. Right now, this thing is purely about the details, so naturally it's not even remotely optimized. Remember how the faces looked back when we assembled our metaballs? Here's how our alloy looks now. There is no universe where you'd ever need something at this level for what we're doing. But that didn't stop Yandev from putting a toothbrush with 50,000 polygons into his game. If you don't know who that is, it's a whole rabbit hole. So, how do we optimize it? We remake it! Okay, it's not as bad as it sounds. We're basically trying to create a duplicate in the same position, but with less faces and better edge flow. See how the faces here are pretty much scattered in a web? We want those to basically wrap around in a loosely grid-like pattern, and that process is called retopology. There's a few ways to go about it, but my choice is a combination of box modeling over the original model paired with some modifiers. Among these are the mirror modifier that lets us cut our time in half by only having to do one side of the model, a subdivision modifier that'll boost the poly count of our box model just a titch, and nowhere near the extent of our sculpt, but enough to get a true to form shape. And finally, a shrink wrap modifier, not the kind that we were talking about earlier, but ones for modeling. It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. An object with a shrink wrap modifier will shrink wrap to an assigned object within that modifier. In this case, that's our sculpt. A method of retopology that I see more often is to manually mark out each face around the model by hand, and admittedly you can get better results like this from time to time. But it's situational and also takes much longer. We're not submitting this to a studio or anything, if you don't count the YouTube studio. No, but seriously, for the sake of not taking another 6 months to put out something, I'm just doing it with shrink wraps. It's actually pretty straightforward from here. It's tedious, sure, but as I start pulling out this boxy shape and creating new geometry, you can see that it starts to envelop the sculpt, and we reach some problem areas like the eye sockets and nostrils, where the shrink wrapping gets a bit buggy, and we can actually choose areas where the modifier won't affect the retopology model, using something called vertex groups. These are just groups of assigned faces, and we can make our shrink wrap use the vertex group to figure out where it should and shouldn't affect the model. So, everything gets affected, but those problem areas I can adjust manually as necessary, nice and easy. So, we've devised a retopologized and optimized Allosaurus. Pretty good. And since we already have lower polygon versions of the claws from making them out of boxes earlier, those are pretty much ready to go. If you aren't familiar with the process, there's probably a thought rattling around in your head right now. This looks so much worse than the sculpt. What are you doing? I'll tell you what we're doing. Now that we have access to a high detail and low detail version of the same model, we can undertake the process of baking. Baking in this use case is the process of taking a low poly model and imprinting the high detail model's surface into its series of textures that the low poly model will use. Thing is, we don't have anywhere to put textures on. Models can't just be painted onto. We'll need to designate what parts of the model are taking up what parts of the texture space. Think of it like a 3D cube being dissected into its 2D cube net. That'd be the cube's UV map, and depending on where in the texture it gets placed onto, that's where the textures would reflect back onto the model. Minecraft skins are actually a good example of this. Those weird laid out images for the skins are basically the UV map for a player. So how do we make our own? Well, our 3D software doesn't inherently know where to unwrap this thing, unless you use stuff like Blender's Smart UVs, which don't use those. At least not for stuff like this. The result's just choppy at best. So we'll need to mark out our seams. General rule of thumb is to try and mark a seam edge around areas that flow into each other, and mark loops of seams around areas with hard angle changes so they can be cut into a different section in the UV map. It's a pretty tedious process, not as much as retopology, but it's there. Same goes for the claws and eyes and whatnot, and since we're going to put this all together into the same texture, we can pack all of their UV maps into the same space. Some people like to group UVs manually and others use automatic UV packers. I personally like to use UV Packmaster Pro, since it focuses heavily on packing all your UVs as snugly into the space as possible, which will maximize the quality of our textures. So what now? We get to paint! Going into our texturing programs here, I can load in our low poly model and use its baking features to imprint those details from the high poly model onto the textures of our low one. And this isn't the base color it's doing, it's creating a series of textures that specifically affect the way the model is rendered and affected by lighting. Now we can get into the real meat and bones of the texturing process, starting off with a base color overlay to get that nice swampy chartreuse of our original Allosaurus, and we'll continue like that and assign flat colors where appropriate to get an initial visual direction. Once that's all done and dusted, it's time to use the brushes our texturing software gives us to draw in some surface imperfections, stuff like a darker tone drawn in with a dirt brush to give that kind of organic, subtly blotchy feel, and then fade it out as necessary. We'll also go ahead and use a texture we got from the baking process called a curvature texture, which is literally that. Wider parts are harder edges and darker parts are smoother edges, and we can softly overlay that to give the illusion of some more detail, since the curvature texture isn't visible by default, but it's instead a means for automatic texturing functions to figure out where to paint. Now what's a dinosaur without its scales? I don't know, but we can layer on some procedural textures to give the impression of skin details and mask it out where necessary, using some larger scales for the back and some smaller softer ones for the underbelly. These affect the color, but I'm also making them affect the height so we can actually let it affect the lighting hitting our dinosaur. With some finishing touches to polish it up, I'm actually pretty happy with the final results. We're so close. So what's left? First and foremost, I'm taking this guy back into our modeling software to assign all these fresh new textures onto the model and figure out if there's anything to adjust. Now we need to make this thing move. So how do we go about it? Rigs are a term that refers to the full 3D setup required to make a model move individual parts of itself. In this case, stuff like the arms and legs and all that good stuff. So we need to build a skeleton! Starting off with a single bone, I'm just creating new creating new bones from that point and naming them as necessary. Stuff like the spine bones, tail bones, neck, head, arms, and legs, you get it. Bones. Once that's complete, we still can't move our character. Not yet. We need to assign our skeleton as the parent of our model, meaning it basically holds priority over it in the hierarchy. If the skeleton moves, so does our dino, but only as a whole, not in parts. If you remember, I mentioned vertex groups earlier for shrink wrapping. Having a group of faces be assigned to a specific named group. Well, assigning this model to our skeleton has created a vertex group for each individual bone, and now we can assign faces to each vertex group correlating to each bone. We can also adjust these using something called weight painting, with weights in this context being how heavily a part of a model is affected by a vertex group. Blue is nothing and red is totally affected, and now we can just smooth out any janky weights as necessary and figure out anything wrong with the rig. As the final phase of our first subject is complete, we can finally take a step back and appreciate the fruit of our efforts. I present to you... Allosaurus! Before we move on, I do want to make a note for as much as I'll make fun of these, the artistry of these original pieces are actually quite good when you look past the scientific accuracy of it, and it's clear the people that illustrate these are just doing a job with the info they have. That being said, it's fun to poke at it a little bit compared to the information we have now. But let's move on, shall we? Next up on our docket is this one. I'm gonna be real, I genuinely have no clue what this is meant to be, and I'm honestly a little suspicious that it's just an Allosaurus again, because these retrosaurs, as they've been called, cool name by the way, seems to have a lot of instances of Allosaurus, though a tag on the post I found it on says Carnotaurus, so we're gonna block that in. That being said, this one looks more like a dinosaur that got fused with like a katydid or imperfect cell. I think the most immediately eye-catching features are in the face, which has this segmented, almost armored-looking head as opposed to the Carnotaurus' normal horned head, and these crazy long teeth that could rip anything to shreds, and like a nose bump, it's kind of hard to tell. But the most glaring thing to me is this torso area. Notice anything weird? This dino not only has a set of human pecs, but a set of opposable thumbs. It looks like some guy got fused into the front of this thing, and frankly I can't think of a more horrific fate. Nonetheless, it's my next pick for adaptation, and I'm wasting no time moving on. I found this art from the same place as the last one, that being a blog called Love in the Time of Chasmosaurs, except this time I can't pin down the book it originated from. But based on the watercolor art, it definitely came from a vintage dino book of some kind. Nonetheless, same as our first dinosaur, we're using metaballs again to build the silhouette of our mystery dino by comparing against the reference art and assembling various shapes until we have something that resembles what we want. Considering both our dinosaurs have a similar body plan, the only real deviation in this process at this stage is the proportions, with this thing being far bulkier and rounder, with its pelvis area coming pretty close to a sphere, along with a shorter but far girthier tail. Following our metaballs, we'll also create and align some claws using box modeling paired with subdivision and mirror modifiers, and with our creative muscles already warmed up, we're already good to start sculpting in our shapes. Since metaballs are set shapes, the tail is a bunch of individually sized pill-shaped metaballs. As a result, it has a bit of a stepped look to it, where the angles slope at slightly bumpy angles. As a result, I use some smooth brushing and a move brush to smooth the shape out and make it look like a streamlined tail. While the Allosaurus we did is intended to have its tail drag on the floor given its slender build, the bulk of the tail here comes across as something of a counterweight to the bulk of its front, which if I'm not mistaken is actually the purpose of a lot of large dinosaur tails and the reason why they're depicted as being suspended above the ground much of the time. The musculature of this Carnotaurus is incredibly defined. In fact, a lot of its shapes are, especially with a segmented head like that. And looking at it now, I wonder if it's meant to resemble the bony head armor of Pachycephalosaurus in some way. Heck, maybe that's what this is. Although the Pachy was a herbivore, so I wouldn't wager on it. Nonetheless, we can define these muscles pretty easily by building up on the model using our clay build-up brushes and work our way from the shoulders down to the back and over the pecs, and then up the neck. I'm making sure to be careful that my brush strokes go in the direction that the muscle fibers would normally stretch, since that gives it a more natural look as we work away at it and the shapes start to blend together. Once I work my way to the head, it's time to define the mouth by carving into the front of the face and drawing some elevation at the edges to create lips, and it just goes on like that. Comparing to reference, I can create the necessary shapes to depict muscles by building up mass on the model and digging away in places like the mouth, nose, and eyes. And it's only when I get to working on the segmentation of the head that I can switch to something called the Dam Standard Brush, which carves in dams, or in other words lines, which is very useful for drawing in the edges of our head armor and giving it a believable inset. From there, it's just a matter of trying to draw contouring lines all around the model to avoid the model looking too smooth. With the body sculpted, now's our chance to place in some teeth, and it's all the same as the others. Box modeling a subdivided cube into a point to resemble a tooth. However, this time, we're also creating a set of gums, which also use a mirror modified and subdivided cube. But instead of pulling it out to a point, we're extruding it in a C shape to resemble the base of those gums, and we can build our teeth into that base. The tongue uses the same modifier setup, but with an inset in the center to resemble the inset you see on tongues. And just like that, we're already making some good quick progress. Now, we could just move on to optimizing our model in a lower polygon one now, but I want to give our gums and teeth some definition too. So it's back to the sculpting phase to put some indents and bumps on the gums that correlate to the positioning of our teeth, as well as going over some other parts of the body again that needed some extra work. I went over and began repositioning the eyes to more closely resemble the original art, as well as smoothing out some harsher areas on the back so we don't end up with a dinosaur that looks like it's constantly in a full body cramp. On the fingers, I also sculpted in a slight rim to it so that the claws look more like they're coming out of the fingers rather than being stuck on, and defining the edges around the eyes and nostrils more so that it can look a bit cleaner and crisp. Now we're well and truly ready for optimization. While our Allosaurus from earlier received a box modeling treatment for its retopology, here I want to try and get a more accurate translation of its surface from the high to low polygon versions. As a result, I'm still using a combination of modifiers including mirror, subdivision, and shrink wrap. However, this time I have my cursor set to align to the surface of the model while I manually mark out each face of the edges and fill them in as I go. Bigger areas like the tail and main body don't get as extreme of a look over, but places like the face and especially around the eyes and mouth are places that I want to painstakingly go over by hand to try and get the best looking result. Slowly but surely, I have a retopologized maybe Carnotaurus. Still not sure what this is, but it's starting to grow on me. Honestly, kind of a cool looking design. It's so monstrous. If anyone does end up figuring out where this art came from, please shout it out because I'd hate to let this thing go uncredited. Once the retopology process is complete, it's time to UV unwrap our dinosaur, which if you'll recall is the process needed to allow the model to be painted on and apply textures. Same principle here, we'll mark out loops to cordon off parts like the arms, head, and tail, and split them down the middle so that our model can properly lay itself flat onto the UV texture space. Now that we have a high resolution and low resolution version of our Carno, we're capable of once again baking the details of the high res one onto the textures of our low res one. Placing base colors for this guy is interesting because its color palette is really not that varied. It's a bright lime green color, and even the webbing in its mouth is the same color, which I found interesting. So, our main three colors are defined. Green for the skin, an off-white for the claws and teeth, and a deeper and paler shade of red for the eyes and mouth area respectively, plus black for the pupils. I decided to give the surface of the skin a lighter tone on the upwards facing angles of the dinosaur, akin to bleaching or dryness from the sun, as well as a darker brush that just goes along the grain of the body's contours to simulate the brushstroke look that exists in the original art piece as a result of being a traditional painting. For skin imperfections, I used two different scale patterns sized differently, with a larger scale pattern taking up the back and outward facing areas, and a smaller scale pattern for places like the underside of the belly and tail, hands and feet, and the face area. Although I made sure not to define the pattern as strongly on the bony plates of the face, since I wanted it to have a more solid look to emulate the rigidity of it. When looking at this art for the first time, I initially thought strands of grass were protruding from the foreground, but when it came to actually look over this thing more closely, I realized this dinosaur has popping veins. I don't know why this was a design choice outside of bringing home just how roided up this thing looks. So naturally I had to draw them in with a simple height layer drawn in lines over the body. So, we've got our Carnotaurus, but once again it has yet to move. Except this time, rather than creating a whole new skeleton, we already have the one from our Allosaurus. While the proportions are a bit different, the body plan is about the same considering both of these dinosaurs are theropods. As a result, we can actually just copy the skeleton from our Allosaurus and edit the positioning of the bones to align with our Carno, and the process of assigning parts of the body to each bone is relatively simple from there. Blend is what I'm using to model, and it's also what I'm using to rig the dinosaur right here. Blender comes with an automatic rigging feature that is honestly a hit or miss depending on how well your model is set up, but for the most part this model actually played quite nice with the process, and the only parts that needed heavy manual adjustment were the areas around the mouth and eyes, as those were the places in close proximity to other bones with smaller pieces within them like teeth and eyeballs. But after a job well done, that's 2 down. Say hello to Carnotaurus, an apex predator of its time and an absolute beast in this iteration. If you guys are liking this stuff so far, it'd mean so much if you gave a like or subscribe to see what I'd put out in the future. On the flip side, if you think the presentation could be improved, absolutely give me your thoughts. I'm always trying to find ways to present this stuff without just boring people, and I always appreciate some good criticism. Remember how at the start of the video I mentioned that we're not just doing dinosaurs? Well, this is it. I'd like to present you with a stack of bones. Now, which of these prehistoric animals do you think this paleontologist was attempting to assemble with these? Woolly rhinoceros, horned gopher, aurochs, that's like a prehistoric cattle, unicorn. That's right. Behold the Magdeburg unicorn. No, I'm not kidding. This thing was a 17th century reconstruction that did consist of woolly rhinoceros bones, except it was alleged to belong to a unicorn, and is known as the single worst fossil recreation in history. This one I will make fun of, because I know it was the 17th century, but people had an idea what unicorns were supposed to be, right? Surely people knew what horses were. I mean, unicorn does just mean one horn, so I guess technically they got the concept, and unicorn was once an old-timey way to refer to a rhinoceros, but I just can't ignore those legs, man. I will say though, with a body like that, it's gotta be aerodynamic as hell. Either way, you know the drill, and we're gonna jump right into this one. Same as before, we're creating the initial build of our creature using a metal base that'll be mirrored to get both halves. I'm also using the same process for the teeth, gums, and horn that I did for the previous 2 models, using a mirrored and subdivided cube and creating geometry to block out the pieces of our model so we can have a better reference point while we're sculpting. I'm initially just basing this off of the skeleton from our reference image, but I do want to say that while there are paleo art adaptations of this reconstruction, in the spirit of how absolutely off-kilter this thing is, I'm gonna shrink wrap the design. And when I say that, I don't mean in the sense we've been using it in our modifiers, but the term used in paleo art that we mentioned way earlier at the start, to refer to a specific phenomenon that you've likely seen. A lot more modern scientific depictions of prehistoric creatures appear a bit fatty and realistically padded between the skin and musculature, and this is a correction from a previous trend known as shrink wrapping, in which depictions of prehistoric animals, and in particular dinosaurs, are shown with little to no fat content and instead have their skin seemingly cling right to their muscles and bones, giving a gaunt, sunken-in look to their faces. I suspect Jurassic Park played a part in this, but one of the places that brought it to attention was a paleo art book known as All Yesterdays, produced by a variety of artists where they parodied these kind of trends in the depictions of these animals. Fun fact, one of the artists that worked on this book was C.M. Koseman, which some of you might recognize as the author of All Tomorrows, that book about speculative human evolution. And I tell you what, wouldn't mind adapting some of those things into 3D someday. But enough dilly-dallying. I'm gonna make this unicorn with a shrink-wrapped depiction in mind, and now it's time to get sculpting. Right off the bat, we're gonna define the area around the mouth, creating a deeper hole and sculpting in some lips around the rim. Following that is the placement of our eyes and nostrils so we can get the structure of the skull established, and I'm also going to pull out the chin for that bony look, and start building up depth where the skull protrudes and insets, as well as adding musculature in places where it'd be denser, like the jaws and temple areas. Moving down the neck, we're just building up mass and muscle where necessary, and using harder angles in places where the bone structure would be denser or more prevalent. There's not much variation in the distribution of the muscles compared to the previous two creatures, with the exception that there are no arms here, just legs. So the muscles don't contour into a set of shoulders at all, instead just flowing straight through the thighs down to the legs. The tail's also a bit weird. The original image has these ribs or spines of some kind jutting out from underneath, which I can't imagine is structurally practical for this animal, especially considering how far in it goes. But nonetheless, a simple base of muscles is sculpted into the torso and legs, and we can go back to the head and introduce some more detailing, like defining more of the edge around the nostrils, lips, eyelids, and the horn hole, as well as polishing out the overall surface a little bit more. We want to define the muscles just a touch more on the rest of the body, and to do that I'm using the Damn Standard brush that lets me carve lines into the mesh, which I'll use to more clearly mark out places that should be more clearly separated and more heavily define some of the lines in the more powerful areas of the musculature, in particular the area around the legs. And since we're going with a shrink wrap design that clings to the bone, I'm also going to add some bumps along the center of the back that depict a protruding spine coming from the back seam of our Magdeburg unicorn. Now we can just go over some of the forms and try to better polish out the shapes and surfaces, making it look a little less rough and more organic. The body of this animal is looking pretty solid, and the only thing I have left to do is go over other pieces like the horn, toenails, and teeth. I later realized I didn't do a tongue, so I actually just stole the one that I made for the Allosaurus, and it might be a little lazy, but it also saves us a little time. Using a clay build-up brush, we can build up a subtle bit of grain on teeth, toenails, and horn to make it more closely resemble bone, and once that's done, our sculpt for the Magdeburg unicorn is complete. But as you'll well know by now, we're not done yet. It's time for optimization. Considering this model doesn't have hands and is pretty much just a head on some legs, retopologizing this is actually kind of a cakewalk. The process is more akin to when I did the Allosaurus, the first one we did, compared to the Carnotaurus, just using box modeling to create a basic cage around the model and utilizing a mix of subdivision and shrink wrap modifiers, not the shrink wrap we talked about earlier, but the one from way earlier. The exception to this strat is the head, which is just far too complex for me to do with the box modeling in any practical way, so instead I'm actually going to apply the subdivision modifier for the model, giving me access to hard edit the extra faces on the model, and mark out those faces out over the face's contours, like the area around the eyes, nostril, and mouth. It's a bit tedious, but it's all worth it in the end. Since the teeth and horn were already sculpted off of low polygon base versions, I can just use those for the lower resolution versions, and with that, we now have a low polygon version of our unicorn, as well as the high res sculpt. I won't bore you with another explanation of UV mapping, but marking out the seams on this model and then wrapping it onto the texture space is the last step we need before moving on to the texturing process. After baking the details of the high-resolution model onto its optimized counterpart, we'll visualize the base colors using a deep brown as the primary color and a lighter desaturated version for secondary areas like the parts around the nose and mouth where fur wouldn't really extend. Same as the Carnotaurus, I'm also applying a lighter, more orange color on areas that are facing upwards, both to emulate the sun bleaching and also to define some fur height, as this light texture has a slight elevation on its height layer, and I'm drawing it in using a fur brush to give the appearance that there's hair on this animal. The teeth, toenails, and horns are a yellowed color to match the warm hues of the rest of the character, with the yellowing being controlled by a thickness texture that we got from baking in the high-resolution model's textures earlier. The eyes are a simple red on black with a round pupil with heavy gloss to simulate the wetness of an eyeball, and from here we're just working on some of the subtler stuff. Stuff like making the fur look just a little bit cleaner and introducing some dirt that's masked on using procedurally generated smart masks that use our baked high-res textures to calculate where the dirt would be distributed. I also used some procedural textures as masks for texture layers that used elevated height and laid them out on areas with less fur and more exposed skin to give it a more realistic appearance, emulating the surface of that skin. There's only one step left, and that's rigging. I actually just straight up stole the skeleton from the Allosaurus again, but this time I deleted the arms and aligned what was left to the Magdeburg unicorn. Automatic rigging processes basically did all the work for the body from the neck down, and I only needed to manually adjust the areas around the eyes, mouth, and tongue, as these are just smaller and more closely packed, so naturally the automatic rigging process just can't differentiate between them as easily. But in no time at all, our unicorn is ready to rumble! Take a look. You don't see a creature like this every day. So what comes next? Well, I was initially planning on making a whole long cool fight scene with these little devils, but then I remembered I'm straight up one guy, and editing takes longer than I think it does. But I'm no clickbaiter. So, to the best of my ability, let's get a quick confrontation going. This is a different topic to my other stuff, and if you did stick around for the whole thing, it really means the world. I think dinosaurs are cool, and this was a fun idea to execute on. So if you want to stick around and see what I do next, subscribing is probably the best way to get notified on it. I don't have like a Discord or a Patreon or whatever, and I don't think we're there yet. But speaking of the subscribers, as of me closing out this video, the channel is sitting like 50 subs away from hitting 60k, which is absolutely mind-boggling to me. And I'm just so interested that you're interested in what I make. So, for now, I bid you all farewell. Thanks again, everyone.